The warm April evening of 1943 found Joseph Stalin in his Kremlin office, studying intelligence reports from multiple sources that documented German preparations for major summer offensive against the Kursk salient. The Supreme Commander, who had spent 2 years witnessing the Wehrmacht's tactical and operational superiority, who had seen Soviet armies destroyed through encirclement and maneuver, who had learned through bitter experience that German offensive capability remained formidable despite Stalingrad's defeat, was confronting evidence that suggested the upcoming battle at Kursk would represent decisive test of whether the Red Army had evolved into force capable of defeating German attacks through defensive preparation and counteroffensive, rather than through desperate improvisation and acceptance of catastrophic losses. The intelligence indicated that German forces were concentrating armor in unprecedented numbers for attacks on the northern and southern faces of the Kursk Bulge, that Hitler had postponed the offensive multiple times to allow newer tank models to arrive, that German command was staking everything on achieving breakthrough that would restore Wehrmacht's offensive dominance and would shift strategic initiative back to Germany. Stalin's recognition that this battle would either validate the Red Army's transformation into modern military force or would demonstrate that Soviet forces still could not withstand determined German assault marked his understanding that Kursk would decide not just tactical outcomes but the fundamental question of which side would dictate the war's course through 1943 and beyond. The background to Stalin's assessment traced to the strategic situation that had developed following the Soviet victory at Stalingrad. The Red Army's winter offensive of 1942-43 had driven German forces back hundreds of kilometers, had liberated substantial Soviet territory, had created Kursk salient that projected westward into German lines. The salient represented both opportunity and vulnerability. Opportunity because it positioned Soviet forces for potential offensive operations toward Ukraine. Vulnerability because the bulge could be attacked from north and south simultaneously in pincer movement that might encircle Soviet forces within it. Stalin understood from briefings by General Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky that German command would recognize the operational opportunity that Kursk presented and would likely attempt to exploit it. The intelligence that reached Stalin through March and April 1943 came from multiple sources whose convergence created high confidence in assessments. The Lucy Speiring, operating in Switzerland, provided information from sources within German High Command about operational planning for summer offensive. Soviet partisan networks reported German troop concentrations and logistics, preparations in areas from which attacks against Kursk would be launched. Aerial reconnaissance photographed German assembly areas and detected arrival of new equipment. Radio intercepts revealed communications patterns consistent with major operation being prepared. Each source independently pointed to same conclusion. German forces were preparing pincer attack against Kursk salient designed to encircle and destroy Soviet forces within it. The Lucy Rings reports proved particularly valuable because they provided details about German operation that could not be obtained through other means. The intelligence indicated specific German force allocations, identified units being moved to Kursk area, revealed timing estimates for when offensive would begin. The specificity of Lucy Ring reporting gave a credibility that more general intelligence might have lacked. The Stalin remained cautious at trusting any single source given Soviet experience with German exception operations. The partisan intelligence of Fragment of Lucy Ring reporting prevented on-ground observation that verified what strategic intelligence was suggesting. Partisan observers behind German lines reported seeing concentrations of armor being assembled in forest areas near Orel, north of coast, and near Belgorod, south of the salient. The partisans documented arrival of Tiger tanks that Soviet forces had encountered only in limited numbers previously, noted construction of supply depots that would support major offensive, observed German engineers improving roads and railroads to handle heavy military traffic. The partisan reporting confirmed the German preparations were real, rather than deceptive measures designed to distract Soviet attention from offensive elsewhere. The aerial reconnaissance that Soviet air forces conducted over German rear areas provided photographic evidence of troop concentrations, equipment marshalling areas, and logistics preparations. The photographs were analyzed by intelligence specialists who compared images taken days apart to track arrival of new units, to identify specific equipment types based on visual signatures, to assess readiness of German forces for offensive operations. The photo interpretation provided quantitative assessments of German strength that informed Soviet planning about how many reserves would be needed to defend against and to counterattack German offensive. The signals intelligence that Soviet radio intercept units collected revealed patterns in German communications that suggested timing and direction of planned offensive. The intercepts showed increased radio traffic between German headquarters and units in Kursk area, detected specific call signs associated with panzer divisions, identified communications patterns typical of forces preparing for major operation. While German communication security prevented Soviet forces from reading encrypted messages, the patterns and volumes of traffic provided insights into German intentions that informed Soviet planning. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who'd been appointed Deputy Supreme Commander and who directed successful defensive operations at Moscow and Stalingrad, briefed Stalin in mid-April that intelligence indicated German offensive at Kursk was virtually certain, and that Red Army faced fundamental strategic choice. Zhukov outlined two options. Soviet forces could launch preemptive offensive to disrupt German preparations, or Soviet forces who prepared defensive positions to absorb German attack and then launch counteroffensive on German forces and adjusted in choice. Zhukov's recommendation was for defensive approach, arguing that German forces would commit their armor to attacks against prepared Soviet defenses, that German losses would be unsustainable, that Soviet counteroffensive launched from positions of strength would achieve greater results than preemptive attack launched before defenses were fully prepared. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, Chief of the General Staff, supported Zhukov's recommendation with detailed operational analysis. Vasilevsky briefed Stalin that German armor concentrated for Kursk offensive represented substantial portion of Wehrmacht's remaining offensive capability, at aligning Germans to attack capability defenses would enable Red Army to inflict losses that Germany could not replace. A German offensive would create opportunities for Soviet counteroffensives that could liberate substantial territory. Vasilevsky's briefing emphasized that defensive approach required faith in Red Army's capability to withstand German attacks. But the evidence in recent operations suggested Soviet forces achieved organizational maturity and defensive competence that made the approach viable. The April conference, where Stalin approved the defensive strategy for Kursk, represented critical decision that demonstrated the Supreme Command as evolution as military leader. Stalin's instinct through early war had been to order immediate counterattacks rather than to accept defensive posture, to insist that every position be held rather than to trade space for time, to reject suggestions that Red Army should allow enemy to attack first, rather than seizing initiative through offensive action. The approval of defensive strategy at Kursk showed that Stalin had learned to trust professional military judgment, to accept that sometimes allowing enemy to attack prepared positions was sounder strategy than attempting to preempt through offensive operations, that Red Army had evolved to point where defensive then offensive approach could succeed. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Central Front that could defend the northern face of the Kursk Seine, received orders in late April to prepare defenses in unprecedented depth. Rokossovsky's engineers began confronting defensive positions that extended over 150 kilometers from forward to Hutchins to strategic depth, incorporated multiple defensive belts with interlocking fields of fire, positioned anti-tank weapons and artillery to cover likely German avenues of advance. The defensive preparations represented application of lessons learned from earlier battles about how to organize defenses that could withstand German armor assaults, reflected Soviet understanding that German tactical superiority required defensive advantages to neutralize. General Nikolai Vertutin, commanding the Voronezh front that would defend the southern face of the salient, implemented similar defensive preparations with emphasis on anti-tank capabilities. Vertutin's forces placed thousands of anti-tank guns in defensive positions, laid extensive minefields to channel German armor into killing zones, positioned tank reserves to counterattack German penetrations. The preparation reflected recognition that German offensive would be spearheaded by new heavy tanks, Panthers and Tigers, that Soviet forces had not previously encountered in significant numbers, and that would require concentrated firepower to destroy. The intelligence about German delays in launching the Kursk offensive created strategic advantage for Soviet forces. Each postponement from May to June, from June to early July, provided additional time for Soviet defensive preparations, allowed more mines to be laid, gave more time for reserves to be positioned, enabled more thorough reconnaissance of German assembly areas. Stalin understood from Zhukov's briefings that German delays were working to Soviet advantage, that Hitler's insistence on waiting for more Panthers and Tigers was giving Red Army time to prepare offensives that would negate the advantages those new tanks were supposed to provide. The May intelligence reports about German force concentrations documented the scale of Wehrmacht commitment to Quest operation. The reports indicated German forces assembling for the offensive included 40 divisions, approximately 3,000 tanks and assault guns, 10,000 artillery pieces. The force represented enormous concentration that demonstrated German command's recognition that Kursk operation was critical to regaining strategic initiative. The intelligence suggested that German forces would attack with overwhelming local superiority in sectors chosen for breakthrough attempts, that Soviet defenses would face maximum test of their capability to withstand concentrated German assault. Stalin's June meetings with front commanders at Kursk demonstrated the Supreme Commander's hands-on approach to ensuring the defensive preparations were adequate. Stalin questioned Rokossovsky and Vertutin quickly about defensive depth, about anti-tank weapons deployment, about reserves positioning, about contingency plans if German forces achieved penetrations. The detailed questioning showed Stalin's understanding that the battle's outcome would depend on defensive preparations and on commanders' ability to respond to developing technical situations, that micromanaging from Moscow would be counterproductive, but that ensuring preparations with thorough was essential. The partisan operations that intensified through June in areas behind German lines supporting the Kursk offensive demonstrated Soviet operational sophistication. Partisan attacks on German rail lines disrupted movement of supplies and reinforcements to assembly areas, forced Germans to divert troops to security duties, created uncertainty about whether offensive preparations could be completed on Gentle. The partisan coordination with regular Soviet forces showed level of operational integration that Wehrmacht had not anticipated Soviet command could achieve. General Pavel Rotmistrov, whose 5th Guards Tank Army represented strategic reserve that would be committed to counterattack after German offensive exhausted itself, briefed Stalin in late June about readiness of his forces at about planned employment. Rotmistrov explained that his armor would not be committed immediately to defensive battle, but would be held in reserve until German attacks had completed German strength, then would be committed to counteroffensive designed to exploit German vulnerabilities. The concept required discipline to maintain resolve despite pressures to commit them to defensive fighting, reflected Soviet confidence that defenses could hold without committing strategic reserves prematurely. The July 5th launch of Operation Citadel, the German offensive against Kursk, brought reports to Stalin that validated the intelligence predictions and the defense's strategy had been duped. German forces attacked from north and south exactly as anticipated, and can't defend the visions that Soviet forces had spent months preparing, fenced defensive far beyond the exceed of what German bands against it for. Stalin received hourly updates through the first days of the offensive, documenting that Soviet defenses were holding, the German penetrations were being contained, the German losses in armor and personnel were mounting without achieving the breakthrough that German operational planning required. The July 12th commitment of Rotmistrop's 5th Guards Tank Army to counterattack at Prokhorovka represented implementation of the strategy that Stalin had approved in April. Absorb German offensive through prepared defenses, then commit fresh reserves to counteroffensive when German forces were exhausted. The massive tank battle at Prokhorovka involved over 800 tanks in confined area, resulted in heavy losses to both sides, marked the point where German offensive momentum was broken and Soviet counteroffensive capabilities demonstrated. Stalin understood from reports about Prokhorovka that the battle validated the defensive than offensive strategy, and proved that Red Army could engage Wehrmacht in mobile operations and could achieve operational objectives through superior concentration of force. The July 17th decision by Hitler to terminate Operation Citadel and that strategic initiative had shifted irrevocably to Soviet forces. Stalin received intelligence about Hitler's decision with recognition that the moment he had anticipated had arrived. German offensive capability had been tested against prepared Soviet defenses and had been found inadequate. Red Army had demonstrated it could withstand Wehrmacht's best efforts, and strategic balance on Eastern Front had shifted fundamentally in favor of Soviet Union. The Soviet counteroffensives launched in mid-July toward Orel in the north and toward Kharkov in the south demonstrated that Red Army possessed not just defensive capability, but offensive capability that could exploit German vulnerabilities created by failed Kursk offensive. The counteroffensives achieved rapid gains, liberated substantial territory, demonstrated operational tempo that Wehrmacht could not match given its completed strength. Stalin understood from reports about counteroffensive successes that Kursk had indeed been decisive. German forces would never again mount major strategic offensive on Eastern Front. Red Army seized initiative, but would maintain through remainder of the war. The August liberation of Kharkov marked simple victory that demonstrated how completely strategic situation had shifted. Kharkov had changed hands multiple times through war, had been symbol of Wehrmacht's offensive capability when German forces had recaptured it in early 1943. Soviet recapture of Kharkov in August represented not just territorial gain, but demonstration that Red Army could conduct Karpik's offensive operations, could coordinate multiple fronts, could achieve objectives despite German efforts to prevent them. The strategic assessment in Stalin's military Vars Poirier Ost emphasized that Kursk had represented lost German attempt to regain strategic initiative through offensive operations. Henceforth, German forces conducting defensive warfight, the Red Army would hit operational tempo and would choose when and where to attack. The assessment concluded that while substantial fighting remained and the German forces would contest Soviet advances stubbornly, the fundamental question which side would control the war's direction had been decided in favor of Soviet Union. The casualties at both sides suffered at Kursk documented the battle's intensity and its strategic significance. German forces lost hundreds of thousands of troops killed, wounded, or captured, lost substantial armor that could not be replaced, consumed reserves that would be desperately needed for defensive operations against subsequent Soviet offensives. Soviet casualties were severe, perhaps higher than German losses in absolute numbers. But Soviet Union possessed manpower and industrial capacity to replace losses, while Germany did not. The asymmetry in replacement capability meant that two battles favored Soviet Union. Germany could not sustain losses of Kursk rates for extended period. A technological lesson from Kursk demonstrated that German advantages in army quality were being neutralized by Soviet advantages in numbers and in defensive preparation. The Panther and Tiger tanks that Hitler had waited for before authorizing Citadel proved vulnerable. Soviet anti-tank weapons were engaged in prepared defensive positions, broke down mechanically at rates that reduced German effective strength, did not provide the decisive advantages that German planning had anticipated. The experience validated Soviet approach of producing large numbers of adequate weapons. Rapid small numbers of superior weapons demonstrate that quantity had quality on its own and properly employed. The operational lessons that Soviet command learned for Kursk and created validation of defensive then offensive strategy. Confirmation prepared defenses could withstand concentrated German armor attacks. Demonstration that Soviet forces could conduct large-scale counteroffensives that achieved strategic objectives. The lessons informed Soviet planning for subsequent operations through 1943 and 1944, established patterns that would characterize Soviet operations through the remainder of war, proved that Red Army had evolved into force capable of defeating Wehrmacht through superior operational planning rather than through desperate measures and acceptance of unlimited casualties. The psychological impact of Kursk on both German and Soviet forces was profound and opposite. German troops who had believed that Wehrmacht remained superior despite Stalingrad learned at Kursk that Soviet forces could defeat German attacks through competent defense and could conduct successful offensives that German forces could not prevent. Soviet troops who had feared German tactical superiority learned that prepared defenses could stop German armor, that Red Army could win major battles through better preparation and better operational planning. The psychological shift reinforced material and operational troops that were changing strategic dance. The moment when Stalin learned that Kursk would defy the East could not be identified as single Red Legion, because recognition developed progressively through April to July 1943. The April intelligence showing German preparations suggested that major battle was coming. The strategic choice to adopt defensive approach rather than preemptive offensive showed Stalin's understanding that battle would be critical test. Successful defense in July demonstrated that Soviet strategy was sound. The counter-offensive successes validated that Red Army had achieved offensive capability matching its defensive competence. By August, Stalin understood that Kursk had indeed been decisive. German offensive capability was broken. Red Army had seized initiative. Strategic direction of the war had been determined in favor of the Soviet Union. The final assessment was that Stalin learned through the Kursk battle that Red Army had evolved into force capable of defeating Wehrmacht through combination of defensive preparation, operational depth, material superiority, and improving tactical competence. The battle validated strategic approach that emphasized allowing enemy to attack prepared positions rather than attempting to preempt through offensive operations, whose success was uncertain. The victory demonstrated that Soviet Union's advantages in manpower and industrial production were being translated into military capabilities that Germany could not match. Stalin recognized that while substantial fighting remained before Germany would be defeated, Kursk had decided the fundamental question of which side would dictate the war's course, and had established that path to Berlin lay through continued Soviet offensives that Wehrmacht lacked capability to prevent.